as my research program has developed, and it's been funded by very generous grants from the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, as well as the Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Sciences, I started to look at some very detailed records in geological type records, and I started to recognize all this influence of the sun in there. And so over the last few years, my perspective has changed. And this sort of thing happens. I'm a scientist, and I go where the science takes me, not where somebody like David Suzuki or somebody wants me to go. Basically, we have to look at things very objectively. So this is kind of what the theme of my talk is today, to talk about a kind of a newer area of research, but there's an enormous amount of literature that's come out of this area just in the last few years. I was commenting to Tom Harris, I drove down with him here today, he's going to be speaking after me, is basically just yesterday, there were 6 papers across my desk, because we have all these internet services now. So it's an area of research, this cosmoclimatology, I think, that's really starting to develop. And sadly, it's kind of got left out of the next IPCC report because these things were written a while ago. So science changes all the time. So it changes all the time. I guess that's more or less the theme. Whoops, I should have put this not to go to sleep. Here we come back again. I guess what we had to find your... this is going to be a helpful hint for me as I go through this talk, is that the computer is going to go to... I should have said it so it shouldn't go to sleep. There we go. So I'll never carry more than a minute on a theme here. Anyway, so without further ado, let's look on. Now, there's one thing that I want to get across to people. There's this strange perspective at the present time that this constancy of climate. Okay, you watch the media, you get this impression all the time that everything just sort of goes like this all the time, and that we're at the present time in some special, unusual time that no one has ever heard of before. Here's a diagram right down here. Here's more or less where we are, right around here, and it basically looks at temperature changes over time. This is 2000. This is going back about 1,000 years or so. So you look where we are right now. We've just come out of something here called the Little Ice Age. Temperatures had warmed up by the 1940s, and it cooled off. Anybody remember through the 70s was pretty cold weather, and then we got about 1980 to start to warm up, and we've been warming up since that time. But if you look back even deeper in time, there was very, very cold intervals through what is called the Little Ice Age. And then prior to that, there was something called the medieval warm episode, which began around 1000 AD, and there was a cooler interval before that as well. And this was the time the Vikings were doing their thing. They were settling, I can't figure out where to stand here. They were settling these western settlements in Greenland and so on. Well, they lost these settlements, okay? Some of them, the sea ice began to build up as the Little Ice Age terminated, as the medieval warm episode terminated, and they became shut off by ice, and they died out for the most part, a lot of these colonies around you. And here's some remnants that are found today. So we went into the Little Ice Age. Here is a French glacier right here. This is where the high ice mark, I guess, was on that glacier. And during the Little Ice Age, well, here we are at the present time. It's warmed up. As you might expect, the glaciers retreat. So this is the scale that we're looking at for the last 1,000 years. We can also, and this is what I'm going to do for the next 2 or 3 slides here, just show you some different scales here. Well, this is where I showed you, this is the scale of the last slide, okay? It was right to here. So this is, now we're looking at, instead of the last 1,000 years, we're going back about 18,000 years. We're in what is termed an interglacial, okay? We're in a very cold episode as far as the history of our planet is concerned. And that we are going through these interglacials when it's like this, it's nice out, and then there's basically intervals when it's very cold and we have 2 or 3 kilometers of ice sitting on top of us around here. So here we are right at the present time, about 18,000 years where if you were sitting here, you'd be sitting under about 2 or 3 kilometers of ice. Then that by 17,000 years ago, that, for whatever reason, that glaciation began to collapse very quickly and things began to warm up very dramatically. Then we went along warming up nicely. And then, just to give you an idea about dramatic climate change, I always laugh. I always hear in the media sometimes these claims about, super fast climate change is the fastest it's ever occurred before. Well, baloney. Even with our own century, there are intervals when it changes faster than these guys claim. Here's something right here called the Younger Dryas cold episode. Basically, in the matter of a decade, temperatures went down 6 to 7 degrees Celsius, stayed that way for about 1,000 years, and then just as dramatically warmed up again. It was as if you were living in Baker Lake in the Northwest Territories at the end of it, and it suddenly turned into Washington, D.C. by the end of the decade. that was how dramatic the climate shifts were. Then we moved into what we call our Holocene. This is this interglacial that we're in. This is the name for this interval. And then we warmed up. Then there was a cold event around 8,200 years ago. And then we went into, they call it the climate optimum. That was around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. It was about 3 degrees Celsius warmer on average globally than it is at the present time. Then things begin to cool. That was the peak of our interglacial. Then it began to cool off. There was an Iron Age cold event, which is often recorded in many of the Icelandic sagas and so on. And then we began to warm up again into the Roman era and into the Little Ice Age, or the medieval warm episode right here. So we're past the peak. Our interglacial, these interglacials last about 10 or 15,000 years. And so we're beyond the peak of ours. No matter what happens, whether greenhouse gases or whatever, we're heading into the next ice age. And within a few thousand years, we'll be back under 3 kilometers of ice where we're sitting right now.